Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is an unusual episode in a few ways. One, there's two people on this conversation with me. I usually just talk to one person at a time. We're dealing with a work of heavy philosophy, this book, this new old book by Richard Rorty. But what's really so special about this episode is the two people you'll be hearing with me today, John McGowan and Meili Steele, were both professors of mine. You've heard John on this show already if you listen to the Dewey episode. Meili was my professor at the University of South Carolina all the way back. Gosh, more than 20 years ago now. And it was with Meili, along with Larry Rue, who you've also heard on this podcast talking about Cavell, that I was first introduced to whatever you want to call it, philosophy, critical theory, political theory, these ideas that I have been working on and you've heard me working on in this podcast. So this is just it's a real connection and circling back for me that I'm incredibly excited about. And the other thing that's circling back is that I started working with John McGowan at UNC on this field of philosophy called pragmatism. I particularly liked Richard Rorty. John didn't always like Rorty as much as I did. And when I started working on anarchism, my first thought was that pragmatism, Jamesian pragmatism, Rortyian pragmatism, maybe Deweyan pragmatism, is the epistemological version of anarchism. And then this book comes out, which is called Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism, but it seems to have been originally called as a lecture, like epistemological anti-authoritarianism. So this book is in fact Rorty working through the way that he calls it anti-authoritarianism. I would call it anarchism, this anti-vertical epistemology. And so now I'm going to talk to these men who trained me in these ideas over the course of decades about whether my ideas are crazy and what they're taking away from Rorty. And now I guess I should turn them over to them to introduce themselves. John, why don't you go first? They've met you before.
Yeah, hi, I'm John McGowan. I'm a retired professor at the University of North Carolina. And for me, Rorty was the gateway drug. He was the way I got into pragmatism, like so many people of my generation. And from that, got led back to Dewey and James. I did have the interesting experience of the book that got me to North Carolina was a book about the French theorists, the postmodernists. And I, at the end of that book, tried to develop my own kind of democratically based critique of the French theorists. And the first I presented this to said, you know, you're just reinventing Dewey, of whom I had never read a word at that point. And so that sent me back to Dewey. But I had already read Rorty because Rorty was part of that book. So I knew that Dewey existed. I just had never read any Dewey.
What year was that, John? Just out of curiosity.
It was 1990.
1990. All right. Meili, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Meili Steele. I'm retired professor at the University of South Carolina. And I reviewed John's manuscript that he's talking about for Cornell University Press. So we got to, I didn't know John at that point, but anyway, that was my first introduction to him. And that book was really stimulated me and was kind of crucial to my intellectual development. But my introduction to Rorty came a little prior to that. I went to an NEH institute called the Linguistic Turn in Continental Philosophy, and Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature was one of the assignments. And I got interested in it and then used it for my job talk at the University of South Carolina. So that was back in what, 86. So I've been around with Rorty for a while. And then I had a chapter in a book called Theorizing Textual Subjects, in which I discussed Rorty versus McIntyre as a kind of a liberal versus communitarian debate, and using kind of dialectically one against the other. And Graham suffered through some of those thoughts, I think, with me right at that time. And perhaps that was part of what got him into it, but I don't know.
No, it absolutely was, Meili. It absolutely was. I took several classes with you. I remember, reading McIntyre. If I read Rorty, I've forgotten it. I have to say, and I shouldn't say this because it's going to take us off course. A new biography, I think a French biography, was just translated of McIntyre, and I haven't read it, of course, but I've read Jonathan Ray's description of it. And in the account of McIntyre is a Marxist who turns in this book, a Marxist who turns his back on, teleological bureaucratic progress and finds that only small communities are places where people can live and be themselves. And as John and all listeners of this podcast know, I have a word for people who think that, and it's anarchists. So I'm confronted suddenly that with the idea that Alistair McIntyre is an anarchist, and that's going to have to be a conversation for another day. I'm afraid, but I'm I'm still working with these ideas, Meili, that you first introduced to me.
The only answer to that, if McIntyre is an anarchist, so is Stalin.
I we're gonna have to talk about this some other time, John.
He does, and I mean, thinks rationality is only possible within a tradition, but he thinks, the modern world is fragmented into many different traditions, so we can't really talk to each other.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something that John wanted to talk about in terms of with Rorty. Let me try and give like a super brief introduction to Rorty, which you two can respond to, and then we can get to the book. So, and I was just working through this stuff for this other podcast I started on games. So this is my narrative of Rorty, which is that he, gets into analytic philosophy coming from this left-wing tradition that he's raised in, and he's very good at analytic philosophy, and he just sort of decides that it's kind of pointless. So first he writes this book, a great book, I think, that sort of repudiates analytic philosophy and this game playing tradition that he comes from, which is called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. Is that right? I always get the book titles wrong. And then he does his great philosophical book, which is Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which is where he takes the tools of philosophy that he used and tries to make something useful with it, useful for a left-wing project, a utopian left-wing project of solidarity that is nevertheless also a sort of bourgeois liberal project, which is why he's so complicated and so frequently denounced on the left wing. The left wing circles that I travel in, the name Rorty is spat out, sometimes along with Stalin. Like that's the kind of loathing plenty of people have for Rorty. And then from there, most of his work seems to be more political and less philosophical after he sort of gets the philosophy out of his system with these two big books. And then this book that was never published in English until recently is, at least the argument of the publisher, is that this is sort of the final big philosophical book, but he had sort of moved on from it. But it's the mature statement of the philosophy that he had been working on. So that's my quick take, and you two can, either of you can jump in there and tell me what you think I've got right and wrong.
Well, I think the only thing I would add for hardcore philosophy geeks is that the break from analytic philosophy was really precipitated by the work of Sellers and a little bit Quine as well. But the fact is that for Rorty, he feels like he's come at the end of analytic philosophy. The analytic philosophy, in fact, has imploded because primarily the work of Wilfrid Sellers. So, the turn then to pragmatism is precipitated by some of the analytic philosophers that he was reading.
And Davidson.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That seems good. So where does one of you want to get us started? I've got lots of ideas and thoughts, but Meili, I think this was your idea, if I recall, that we have this conversation. Not that it was a podcast, but that we have this conversation because you and John were talking. So where would you like to start, Meili?
I started with this quote from the book, where it's from the essay Ethics Without Universal Obligations. And then Rorty said, we think of pragmatism as an attempt to alter our self-image so as to make it consistent with the Darwinian claim that we differ from animals simply in the complexity of our behavior. And that is, instead of thinking that humans can get beyond the world of appearances. So that's where he begins. And I kind of wanted to take up that notion. And I guess I'll put it on the table just a preliminary, because I think it sort of elides the fact that humans live in institutions and not just in a natural world, that we have dollar bills and bank accounts, not just desires for food, right? That our desires are always, shaped by language and environment. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to that, it's peculiar that he wants to claim there's a continuity between animals and humans when he's so insistent that there's no experience outside of language. So, he at two places, very briefly, he mentions the obvious objection to the fact that for him, there is no perceptual experience. He says that clearly, that you always see everything through the lens of language. And the objection, of course, are dogs and babies. And twice he brings that up, and twice he just dismisses it. And it's like, well, dogs don't see things? Or if dogs do see things, they have to see them in an absolutely discontinuous way than the way humans see things, if you grant Rorty's insistence that all perception is through the categories of language. So how he thinks that's Darwinian is very mysterious to me.
Yeah. And well, for me, I think it leads to other, let's say, not so much, I guess, problems where like absences in his work, which is that he doesn't really talk about the way we inhabit a language. He always wants to talk about how we use it. And for me, I mean, the first thing is we've been shaped and made by these different linguistic and, practical structures, and yet he doesn't really interrogate them. So he's always, maybe a good way to put it is, how does Rorty think we change our minds? Right. And I think, he has an interesting essay on psychoanalysis using Davidson in a way. And when he talks about that, because psychoanalysis is you're having a conversation to escape from structures that you can't, bring to consciousness or thematize in a certain way. And through the dialogue, you're trying to access these things that are controlling you, but which you can't really articulate. So when he does that, Rorty says, I think Freud was wrong to talk about the unconscious as a force and a desire, but it's another mind. That you're actually, what you're doing is having a conversation with another self. That you have two selves within you. Good for anarchism, I guess.
Yeah.
But and that you're trying to, work out this conflict between these two selves that are speaking simultaneously, and that's what has you screwed up. So, but for me, but that leads okay. But this is also true of societies, right? Societies are also trying to work through conflicts that they're not fully able to articulate, right? And so there's a similar. So, and I guess that gets to John's question about conflict, which he raised in our exchange prior to the podcast, which is how Rorty does and deal with conflict.
Okay, so we can get to that, but first I want to read this bit because this speaks exactly to what you two were talking about, where I marked this. I got very excited when I saw this on 163, where he says, there's like, we can do therapy for philosophy so that we stop telling these deep stories and start, thinking about using language in this easy way. And he gives an example. The analogy here is with a term like money. Imagine how a barter economy transformed itself into one in which legal currency and commercial credit were in use, and you will know all you need to know both about how money came into existence and about what money is. No mystery remains for philosophers to puzzle about. The illusion of depth vanishes. Now, if you are listening to this podcast, you know that I have been spending more than a year on David Graeber's book, where he explains that this this quick explanation of how philosophy can solve a problem and eliminate depth is not just wrong, but perhaps the deepest wrong thing in our entire society. And Graeber spent years, and people have spent, since Graeber's book, decades excavating the history of money and finding this deep history of it. And this was a place where I just thought, and then you're talking about like, oh, we can just use language, we don't inhabit it. This is the most obvious place. I want to get at some point to some of the good, useful stuff in this book where Rorty just stumbles, at least from my perspective, and collapses flat on his face. He says, you don't need a deep history of something like money. And as someone who has been working on a deep history of money for years now, that was just, it was outrageous. And this is where you can say, like, if Graeber's argument that I agree with is all of these things that we maybe don't like about our world are embedded in this deep history of money, and they're embedded in the deep history of money, and then they're hidden by this very simplistic story about barter. Rorty's insistence that we don't need to think about this story about barter anymore, that we've solved it. It's 2 sentences and we're done. That was just astonishing, and I had to highlight that before we moved on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways to say this is that Rorty is committed to a deeply historical account for human practices. He's an historicist in that sense. And yet his histories are, to say the least, glib. He never does the real historical work. But I would take two points out of that. I mean, besides the Graeber showing us that it's not a transition from barter to money. The first is that what Graeber shows us is that money is tied to an imposition of obligation. So for a Graeber, money is about debt. It's about accounting for who owes what to whom, right? So it's a question of how that obligation, in a sense, gets established and enforced. But the second point, and this goes back to Meili's point, and I think here Meili and I agree completely about the deficiency in Rorty, is that Rorty doesn't understand that that's embedded in institutions. He refuses to think institutionally. So obligations, I mean, in some sense, he wants to say, again, it's crazily superficial. Obligations just come out of loyalty, right? Loyalty is the source of moral obligation. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We exist within sets of practices that are institutionalized. So another way to say this is you have an obligation as a speaker of English to call a dog a dog. If you go around trying to create a private language in the kind of Wittgensteinian way, eventually you're going to get locked up. You're at least going to end up on the couch, because people are going to say, you haven't joined the language you're born into. There's an obligation to speak the words that other people speak. We have a whole grammar police working in our classrooms, to enforce this, right? So in any case, it's the inability to think deeply historically, but also crucially institutionally, that's the problem.
Yeah, and institutions as empowerment, not just as impediments, right? I mean, that's also part of you think about the creation of something like the public sphere, which is a collective creation. I mean, I've kind of gotten into this. I've been reading on the history of the French Revolution, and when the word opinion went from a sort of philosophically degraded idea to something that was elevated into public rationality, public discussion. And there's a kind of flip at a certain period that these historians have traced when opinion went from something purely negative, transitory, not philosophical, to something that was actually democratic and public and worthy of respect. And that it just etymologically, but that's a kind of thing that I think should be crucial to a historicist approach, right? I mean, that you take into account these kinds of things. I mean, not that you have to do the work of a historian, but you could refer to it.
Yeah, thinking to turn Rorty against himself, thinking with what John is saying in terms of these language games and institutions, one of his big objections is that philosophers think they can say, let's define justice to be this, and then they can explain what justice is, and it's this sort of self-contained hermetic thing, and they've defined this thing called justice, and it has no relation to what normal people think justice is. He cites this as the beginning of everything that's wrong in philosophy. This is his moment of when philosophy went wrong. Is Socrates says, nor in Plato. In Plato, Socrates says, because we don't know what Socrates actually says. Socrates says, oh, people don't know what justice is. Well, let's define what justice is over here, and then we can dispense this answer to them, and they have to do what they say. They have to do what we say. Sorry, it's this authoritarian move, and it seems like Rorty is making a similar move, or at least he seems to be not acknowledging that process, that he's in some ways taking on the role of Socrates of, let's say this is this, and then then we can solve all of these problems without dealing with the actual embedded practices of language, which is why he criticizes Austin and Cavell. And I think he's wrong to criticize Austin and Cavell, at least so cavalierly.
Well, he is careful to not open himself up to that critique. I mean, because a couple times he basically says, I can't tell you you're wrong. I can just tell you a different story. So he says, I can't say that, Socrates isn't allowed to play his language game of defining justice, and he can offer it up as a plausible definition and see then if it influences practice. And all I can do is tell us another story. So in that sense, he's a deep irrationalist. He doesn't believe we change behavior or beliefs on the basis of anything rational. It's in terms of better stories. So he really just wants to say, between the poets and the philosophers, the poets have a much better claim to be the unacknowledged legislators. Socrates can try to be a legislator. He can try to be a philosopher king, or Plato. But good luck with that.
When Twitter decides what we think.
Yeah, I mean, Rorty, he clearly likes the poetic philosophers, which I think is why, one of the reasons why, this is too big of a topic to bring up, one of the reasons why he prefers Nietzsche to Foucault, because their ideas have a lot of resonances, but it's so much more fun, I think, to read and think about Nietzsche, and so much less fun to read and think about Foucault. The same reason why James is so superior to Dewey in so many ways, because he's such a better poet, and the philosophers like John and Rorty keep insisting that Dewey is a better philosopher than James, but it really doesn't matter because no one's going to read Dewey. So if you're going to have an unacknowledged legislature, it's going to be James, I think.
Yeah, the one difference is, and it was interesting in this book, right? This book is fiercely anti-religious. And one thing that does happen in the following up years of Rorty's life, he gets much more conciliatory toward religion and the very last things he wrote. But, this goes back to conflict, so maybe to help us. There is that amazing passage, right, where he talks about the parents of his students at Virginia. Do you remember this? Where he basically says, those Bible-toting and he even specifies Southwestern Virginia parents, I'm not going to give them a moment's notice. We're not in conversation, and I'm not trying to help those kids, think of those beliefs as, some kind of set of to be revered practices that they've been born into. I'm trying to get them out of that dungeon. I guess that's a form of conflict, but it's certainly not a form of conversation.
Yeah, we can go ahead, Meili.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to say, well, conflict is fine until these ideas really get purchased in public life. That's, when they come out of Judge Cannon's mouth in the Trump decisions, then they don't sound, are we really just going to say, well, that's just one way of looking at it,
Yeah, okay. So this is good, because this is a place where I like Rorty, and where John and I have disagreed, I think disagreed over the years. And this will go back to, so I'm going to try and introduce this idea that I really like and is valuable in this book. And I wrote an essay on this topic for John in 2007 or 2008 or something like that. And you basically handed it back to me and was like, yeah, good try, but Rorty is wrong here, and you followed Rorty, so you're also wrong. It was more polite than that, but that was the gist of it. But I'm still, unfortunately, John, you haven't convinced me. Talking about changing my mind, I'm still with Rorty on this one, which is to say, and the easiest way to do this is with the Marxists, is to say, like, okay, so there's this world, but I mean, you can do it with religious beliefs, you can do it with whoever you want. There's this world, it's complicated, it's confusing, we don't know what to do. Obviously, it's not just the way we want it to be. So we propose, a new world that we would like to make. And every time someone proposes this new world, they have sort of two versions of this thing, or not two versions. There's what they want to say, and there's a corollary. There's like, the world is bad and here's why, and here's how I want to change it. So we need philosopher kings, or we need a proletarian revolution, or whatever. And then the second thing is, oh, and I am right, and here's why I am right, and here's why my access to truth is greater than yours, and you can't actually argue with me. I mean, you can argue with me, that's allowed until we put you in the gulag, but your arguments bear no weight because you don't know what the truth is, and I do. And I take this to be an authoritarian project, obviously, in most left-wing revolutions, as well as, of course, most right-wing movements. And I take this to be the authoritarian project at the heart of what Rorty calls, the Greek turn in philosophy, going back to Plato. And I don't like it, and I think it's wrong. And of course, everyone thinks they're right, and everyone thinks they have better access to the truth. And if everyone thinks that, the only thing you can do is talk to people or set up institutions that are supposed to collectively decide on this, whether those are democratic or non-democratic institutions, or kill one another. And I don't see a way out of this, but I am most disturbed by the people who are killing one another, not in the claim that they're going to bring about a better world, but in the claim that they're going to bring about a better world, and they are sure that they are right. Because, they are better at knowing the eternal forms, or they know how to make synthetic a priori judgments, or whatever philosophical bullshit you want to throw in there.
So I'm not sure what I just agreed with in terms of that. But I mean, so I guess maybe the way to say it is I was very surprised reading this book by Rorty at how stringent a consequentialist he is. I hadn't remembered that exactly. So, basically his thing is the proof's in the pudding. And, what he doesn't, of course, get to, and this I think was Meili's point, is, well, the proof's in the pudding if we share the same desired outcomes. If in fact your desired outcome is the subordination of women, as it's true in many societies, then you haven't proved anything by the way you're treating women that I disagree with. Because you've gotten the consequences you actually have been aiming for. So
wait, so we've been agreeing all these years, John?
Seems so. So, I mean, so what did I disagree with? I mean, did I want to say that people had a right to a claim to truth? That goes against any kind of notion of fallibilism. And I think Rorty is really good on the topic of fallibilism. He basically says fallibilism is just admitting that there's no final word, that you haven't been positioned in front of every possible audience there ever was who have agreed that you have got the truth. He says, as long as you can imagine or even just presume that there will be a potential audience that would disagree with you, you have no right to a claim to absolute truth. That seems correct.
Okay, good. We agree. Go ahead, Meili.
I think maybe a useful thing that he talks about, it's not in this book, but it's in his essay on Habermas in the book that Brandon edited called Rorty and His Critics. it's universality, and then I'm forgetting the second part, but in it, he makes a distinction between educating and arguing. And when you argue with someone, you assume that you have the same language, that you're speaking the same kind of language. But when you're educating someone, you are asking that person to make a transition from his or her sort of language of self-understanding and world understanding to a new language. And that this is a kind of, I mean, this is his Platonic movement, if you like. But to get you to sort of switch vocabularies, maybe, is another way of Rorty ease to talk about it. And this kind of transition, it doesn't follow from the premises that you have, but it follows if you go through this sort of learning process. I mean, these are learning processes, a kind of big word that they Hegelians like too, because that is that sort of even Habermas uses it to talk about in his early work the sort of growth of the personality into a democratic self. But in any case, I think that for me, that's a kind of useful way of thinking about Rorty, because it distinguishes like his just, well, what the hell, go say whatever you want, and we'll just see whether we like it, to sort of negotiating these different positions. Because I guess getting it back to John's conflict point, that's the closest he gets to how we negotiate. Because that's, I mean, that because even in psychoanalysis, you could say the analyst is kind of coaxing you toward a new way of self-understanding, a new self-description. Anyway, I'll leave that for you guys to chew on.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the other thing, this is a little bit circling back, but it might be helpful. I remembered as we were talking a conversation, Meili, that you and I had during one of your visits to Chapel Hill. So this was, I don't know, 15 or so years ago. And I asked you about the sort of like Marxist kind of what's the matter with Kansas false consciousness argument. If you can believe, this was back when we were worried about Bush, not Trump. If you can believe that, what was wrong with these conservatives, and why they hated the federal government, even though the federal government was giving them all of the stuff they needed to live and everything. And your response was, I would say it was in the sense of this anti-authoritarian. Rorty quotes someone, I can't remember who he's quoting, saying that most people's beliefs are true, or everyone's beliefs are mostly true. And you said something like, I mean, I'll never forget it, is they're willing to live in a world with poverty. They're not willing to live in a world with abortion and gay marriage. They're in fact precisely getting the world that they want to live in. And the Marxist argument that no, you actually want to live in a different world just falls flat. And we don't understand. Well, I understand why they want to live in that world because I was raised by them. None of my progressive colleagues understand, but from our vantage point, that world looks, awful, and it also is incommensurate with our world. But if you go, and I say this too often, but I'll say it again, if you go to the New York Times opinion page, everyone is just there explaining that those Trump voters or Bush voters or whoever are wrong. They're flatly wrong. End of story. And we don't know what to do with them, but gosh, whatever we do with them is going to be right because they are wrong. And I take Rorty to be against that way of thinking. And part of what drove me to anarchism was too many conversations with progressives that just explained to me that everyone who didn't agree with them was flatly wrong. End of story. Indeed, irrational. So an irrational philosopher like Rorty is exactly what I need.
Yeah, I think, maybe here's where I disagreed with you in your earlier paper. So I take it that pragmatism is always about trying to open up the space of possibility. So, pragmatism is against false necessities. And authoritarianism, of course, is always trying to come down on you and saying it's necessary that you do this. So you're trying to loosen the bounds of necessity. But it isn't as if everything is possible. And that's why you have Dewey's emphasis on experiment, that you have to experiment in order to understand what are the constraints. You should always push against any constraints that have been, pre-established. But sometimes you're going to find out, hey, that one's a real constraint. And I think and this goes to, the Charles Taylor piece that Meili loves so much, which seems right, which is the notion of how experience and language both can be disclosive, that in fact they can light up possibilities that exist in the world out there. And, this is where, Rorty admits this. He says, this is why Brandon and McDowell think I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It actually turns out there is something called reality. It's much more plastic than we tend to think of it. We certainly should be skeptical, given the history of science, of any claims of current day science to have arrived at the final definition of what reality is. But it still doesn't mean there aren't constraints at all. And Rorty seems not, in that way, he still seems stuck in his analytic tradition. That's why his strict consequentialism seems to flatten the world.
So I want to take that up, but first I want to, let Meili talk. First I want to say, Meili, did I remember and understand you correctly about right wingers in 2007?
Yeah, you did. I think the point of Thomas Frank's book I was just sort of rephrasing what he said, which is we think that, what's the matter with Kansas? Like, how could they be so dumb, right? And he's saying, well, we're misunderstanding what's going on. They are getting what they want. They are that this is we think that poverty is more important than some kind of religious worldview, but they don't. And to live in that sort of sacred canopy is more important than having bread. So fine, but that not we just anyway. That we're speaking that different language, and I think to get maybe at the Marxist point. I think when kind of coming out of Marx and Hegel, which is the idea of contradiction, is I think one of the mistakes, for at least for me, in this in immanent critique and all those the Marxist thing, that society that there's a contradiction. Let's say that Plessy versus Ferguson is a contradiction. It's not a contradiction for the people of that time. That's exactly what they wanted,
Yeah.
right? This was the realization of our principles at that moment. It wasn't like the contradiction is some kind of external view that doesn't comport with this, the imaginaries, as I like to call them, of the time.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I, have upset students very much and worried a little bit about my job when I was teaching high school, when I taught Plessy versus Ferguson. It's not like, is it a bad Supreme Court decision? Well, sure, from our point of view, it's pretty much the worst. But to teach it as to teach our point of view as the only point of view is dangerous. So then the students are like, so you think it was a good decision? It's like, well, no, obviously not. But I'm trying to get you to understand why people at the time thought it was a good decision and not hold yourself in some sort of simplistic moral superiority over those people. And let me tell you, that's an unpopular opinion in the 21st century American high school classroom.
Sure. But yeah, well, I think it's confusing too. Two things. It's just, you're teaching this sort of taking a historical approach toward these issues rather than sort of using contemporary judgment to talk about them. Anyway, I took anyway, maybe pass it back to you guys. I've thrown out a lot of things here, so.
Yeah, well, no, I think that all made sense in sort of the Marxist stuff and the Frank stuff. So I think that makes sense. And then, this John probably has something to say, but this wants to bring me back, or I want to bring this back around to another Rorty book, a book that seemed to have been mostly forgotten, called Achieving Our Country, until Trump was elected. And suddenly it became the book that predicted Trump. So one of the reasons why Rorty is so unpopular is he seems to be sort of a bourgeois liberal. He seems to be a sort of like UN, IMF liberal. And it's not clear to me that follows necessarily from his philosophical views, but it seems to have been somewhat his policy views. But the other thing that I think makes one of the things that makes him unpopular is that he advanced a critique of whatever you want to call it, the cultural left, what would now be called, if you want to put the right wing has these very broad labels for like CRT or woke or something like that. He advanced a critique of this trend, and he said if this trend continues, where the white working class is always demonized for its racism, and every non-white group is celebrated for its cultural authenticity, and there's an alliance between the bourgeois intelligentsia and racial minorities against the white working class. Eventually, the white working class is going to elect a fake strongman from the billionaire class who's going to claim to strike against the wealthy, but actually immiserate everyone except for the wealthy. And so the day after Trump was elected, this Rorty book went viral, a book that no one had bothered with and had been roundly criticized, as far as I know, by everyone. And well, I don't know. John and I have talked about this a lot, but I take there to be something in that critique from achieving our country, even if so much of Rorty's other politics are so disdained in leftist circles.
Yeah, I mean, that book is a mess, right? And it's a mess
Yes.
because, you know, in some sense, you're right. It's a materialist critique of cultural politics. I mean, in some ways, it's to say we need to pay attention to the material conditions of class and of economic distribution, et cetera, from a guy whose whole philosophy is about changing the vocabularies and about the influence of language. So the way in which he can argue that, the academic left, what he keeps on saying is what they're doing is fine for private projects of self-realization, but have nothing to do with political issues of collective solidarity. And also they shouldn't, be patting themselves on the back as being radical. But what if we see them involved in a Rortyian project of redescription, of telling a different narrative? I mean, Rorty has been telling us that's what politics is. So that's the first problem. The other problem is his position on political obligation and justice, right? If he's right, which he argues vociferously in this book and in Philosophy and Social Hope, that ethical and moral obligations are sentimental and they're all about loyalty, then it would seem precisely that group identification and identity issues are going to be central to politics, and that the whole issue is to just enlarge the group that you feel you share an identity with. So he's a guy who believes deeply in identity politics. He's told us that. That's where all obligation comes from. So then how he can turn around and say, that's a wrong path for people to be following. Now, it's a wrong path to denigrate the people who should be your allies, absolutely. But it's not that you can't appeal to them on the basis of identity. He seems to be saying that's the most fundamentally powerful appeal you can make.
I guess I take Rorty's point to be a little bit like Frank's, though, that if we look at his achieving our country as about just the language self-description point of view, that the sort of contempt for the redneck population, so to speak, has been part of the problem, rather than finding a vocabulary that will embrace the white working class, right? We should and turn away from the sort of elitist vocabularies. I mean, the subject of, Sandel wrote this book, I don't know, the like the dangers of meritocracy.
Tyranny of meritocracy, yeah.
Or whatever. And symbol that our whole society is set up on this winner or loser basis, and that sort of if you want it, the left is bought into the meritocratic way of thinking, and they call it, they like it, dress it in democratic terms, but there's an undemocratic dimension to it.
Yeah, as John knows, I have completely embraced this critique of what looks like progressive center leftism as just a form of meritocracy, a form of meritocracy that is not democratic in any way, shape, or form. And then I would say, John, I think it sounds like Meili and I agree that when Rorty talks about identity, like he's got this thing where he talks about like I think it might be in, Ethics Without Principles or whatever it's called. He talks about like knitting a quilt based on identity, where it's like when an earthquake happens in Guatemala, you care about it because there's Guatemalan immigrants in your town who you care about, which I take to be the precise opposite thing of saying those people in that flyover state have nothing to do with us because we are different, hence the contempt. One of these forms of identity can generate solidarity, and it's a form of cosmopolitanism via sentimental attachments, and the other one is a form of cosmopolitanism that does not generate solidarity. It generates, dare I say, ressentiment, and I'm quite amenable to that argument. I feel like I see it every day in the classroom.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, this is part of my shock at how consequentialist Rorty is. I mean, really, his ethics seems to come down to a universalism of a sympathy, generating and cultivating sympathy for creatures that can suffer. And he even puts in that little thing. And so maybe that means the animals too. You know? So, but it's Bentham. It's pleasure and pain. And we should learn to try to alleviate pain in every case where we can alleviate it.
And I think that's very revealing for someone who claims to be about language, right? That he then moves to a sort of sub-language feeling based.
So Miley, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I do find Peter Singer in infuriating. I find him just infuriating, and I think that his inability to think about language and communication and reduce everything to suffering in the most narrow way is absurd. And I find Rorty much more amenable. But then when Rorty's like, yes, of course we should care about the animals, but also animals and babies don't matter because they can't talk. Talk about a contradiction, an imminent critique. That does seem to be something that needs to be dialectically overcome, but I have no project of overcoming it.
Well, also, yeah. Go ahead, Miley. Sorry.
No, I just think, I mean, he's trying to, I think, move to getting beneath language. It lets him kind of appeal to a universality. Everyone suffers, regardless of what language they express it in. And that gives that can be a basis for solidarity that's sort of unrestricted.
But Rorty has also been good, or at least he opened my eyes to the fact of he has wonderful things to say. I think this is in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity about the cruelties that are linguistic based. So precisely, the kind of contempt for the flyover states that generates then the resentment, et cetera. And, he does say, in fact, it was the French theorist who opened his eyes to that. So there is linguistically produced suffering as well.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Go ahead.
spin back on a positive note, I mean, when I read Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, those first 3 chapters, I felt like suddenly I got, finally this was his philosophy and not his critique of others' philosophies. And that he really laid out a kind of program in those first 3 chapters of that book.
Yeah, and then we've been criticizing him for not paying attention to institutions and the necessity of institutions. But if you want to talk about Rorty as an anarchist, then solidarity is the place to go, right? And I mean, that is in some ways the most appealing part of Rorty's politics. The attempts to create a solidarity and to see what could happen as a result of successfully creating that utopia of solidarity.
Yeah, so let me so obviously the big thing that I want to take away from Rorty in this book, although, I feel like I can get this from James, although Rorty in some ways is more explicit about it and takes on, people like Wittgenstein who, hadn't written when when James was writing, is this, anti-authoritarianism of epistemology. No one knows more than anyone else. So I take this as an anarchy of knowledge. I take this idea of solidarity and, building this quilt of universality, not through abstract principles, but one community and one connection at a time, to be deeply related to the anarchist project. The fact that he seems to take so little account of institutions is, on the one hand, problematic from an anarchist standpoint, in that so much of anarchism has been dedicated to thinking about institutions. But the fact that he thinks that humans could live sort of not embedded by institutions, or seems to apply that, would be, I would say, very sympathetic to me as an anarchist, if I believed in that form of anarchism. But I think that's actually like both a misunderstanding. There are certain people who say these things within the anarchist tradition, but actually very few of them. And that's actually a like easy critique of the anarchists, of like, oh, they don't know what institutions are. And the anarchists are over here like, what? We have a labor union. We were meeting for 10 hours and we have a constitution. What do you mean we don't know anything about institutions? Our institutions are just run very differently from yours. So in that sense, Rorty could be lumped into what's sometimes called the like individual tradition of anarchism, of which the most famous member is this German guy named Max Stirner, and then a German very influenced him by Stirner named Friedrich Nietzsche. And in that sense, that's for me, the bad and wrong kind of anarchism, the Rorty who doesn't seem to be interested in institutions. And that's why an anarchist like Graeber can understand money in a way that the sort of pseudo-anarchist like Rorty cannot, because Rorty thinks he doesn't need to bother with institutions. And the anarchists know you do need to bother with institutions, because it is institutions who will deport you. It's institutions who will put you in jail. It's institutions who will declare labor unions illegal and corporations legal. So the anarchists do not have the privilege of imagining a world without institutions, even if certain fantastical parts of that tradition, this idea sort of resonates with them.
But this goes back to Meili's comment all the way back at the beginning, because all the examples you just listed were negative examples. And Meili says we need to think about how institutions empower.
Not the labor union. The labor union is not a negative example of an institution. And that's actually the one institution that Rorty praises pretty consistently, I think.
Right. But I mean, to think about how do you build institutions that empower, and if institutions, and again, now we get back to necessity, if institutions are inescapable, if human practices are always going to end up being institutionalized in one way or another, which gets back to practically the first sentence in Rorty's book, when he says, I'm declaring my project, all non-human sources of authority are to be thrown over. But he admits there is humanly produced authority. So institutions are another way of trying to think about, well, where is authority? How do you need it? How do you wield it? What's its place within a set of human practices? And, that's, again, where we're saying Rorty never gets into that level of detail.
Well, I have a somewhat related comment to this. It's too much for this at the end of the conversation, but I always react. When William James read Henry James, particularly the Golden Ball, he said, for God's sake, Henry, just say it out. You're great for the innuendos and all the other stuff, but the real world is out there. And since I'm a Henry James fan more than a William James fan, I said, well, I think it's because William James doesn't have a philosophy of language. That he doesn't get it, that Henry has this sort of constitutive, and I had a sort of passages to show that. But that's, I think, part of the issue, at least for me, and that because language is like the fundamental institution, right? That's you can't get around. As John Searle says, something like, if you have a language, you already have a social contract.
Yeah.
You don't have to it's before you get to the state of nature. You're bringing your, if you're going to talk to somebody, you're already bringing your institution.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting too, in the fact that, Wittgenstein, who rarely talked about prior philosophers, hated William James and talked a lot about James. Now, primarily, he was talking about James's principles of psychology, but it would be precisely because James doesn't attend to language.
Yeah, we'll have to carry this along later because Wittgenstein kind of hated Bertrand Russell as well. Sort of, it's complicated, but at various times hated Bertrand Russell, and Bertrand Russell hated James, and then Cavell sort of likes all of them except for Russell. And I'm gonna have to pick this up, with a at a different time, perhaps just in conversation with one or both of you sometimes. I guess the thing that I want to say, the last word I want to have, like from the anarchist perspective, is that precisely. So if the project is, as Rorty says, if the project of pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism is to wrest the like hierarchical power away from God, who towers over the Western tradition until relatively recently, and not replace God with something else, the transcendental ideal, the categorical imperative, or I get lost with my, what is it? Is it synthetic a priori? What's God in Kant? Or is it which one is it, John? Can you tell me?
No, the details don't matter.
Okay, yeah. So, or the progressive God, right, which is capital S science. If the goal is to kill God, Nietzsche style, and not replace him with anything, not even the Ubermensch, then that doesn't mean that you cannot set up systems, institutions, ways of ordering and organizing people. And this is something that Ruth Kinna, who is my favorite current anarchist thinker, said on this podcast, which is the goal is not to have no organization. The goal is to prevent anyone from saying, this is the organization, it is the only one, I am the representative of this organization. You can't leave it. And my power, or the power of someone just like me, extends over all of the geography of the earth. If that is the anarchist project, not no organizations, but the state, Randolph Bourne says government is fine. It's the state that's bad. And that's the kind of anarchism I am interested in. So forming institutions isn't bad. It's when the institutions claim this particular institution speaks for God or the synthetic a priori or science or whatever. There's no way out of it. And if you resist, you will be punished, not because you disagree with me, but because you are simply wrong. Then if that's the project, and that's how I would like to articulate it, then it seems to me that most of this book is sympathetic to that project with some honestly just like laughable issues, like how easy he thinks it is to deal with something like money, that I just, that's why I brought that up, because of how indefensible that is. And then I think what has emerged in this conversation for me is that as much as he seems to get what I'm trying to do right in the broad strokes, his historical work, which he claims is the heart of everything, is laughable. It's risible. His history just seems to be completely ahistorical, and I take that to be a problem for Rorty, but not a problem for me, because I can just go read Graeber or Mumford or someone else who actually knows something about history. Okay, that was my last word. Respond to that. Say whatever you want. I'll be done for now.
No, I mean, I mostly agree with that. I found this book irritating in how cavalier Rorty is about all kinds of things, which, I mean, I always thought of Rorty as kind of the Alfred E. Newman of philosophers. What me worry? I'll leave it there.
That's what he doesn't like about
John.
Cavell, is that no one knows who that is. That's what he doesn't like about Cavell, is that Cavell is always worrying, right? And he wants Cavell to just stop worrying.
I guess for me, it's just like that he stops with anti-foundationalism. I mean, we get that, like we now we need to figure, but that doesn't completely flatten, all values to be the same. I mean, just because you don't have a capital letter in front of a value, it doesn't, right? You can still make priorities.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, look, in some ways that's the question of the entire anarchist project. Unless you want to go to some extreme, I think comical, almost like Rousseauian version of there's not a social contract. So then the question is, what difference does it make whether you worship Yahweh, capital S science, or lowercase s science? And I must insist that it makes a difference whether there's a capital letter or not to be continuing my project, but precisely what difference it makes does seem to be tricky, and we're not going to solve it here on Zoom.
But if we were on Zencaster, we would have solved it.
Definitely. I think if that's good for you two, there's so much more to say, but we took at least an hour. I don't know how long we've been talking, about an hour, and this has been great. So if you're good, we can leave it at that.
Fine with me.
Yep, it's okay.
All right, then I just have to say, thank you so much for everything. I mean, not for being on this podcast, although thank you for that. But I owe the two of you so much, along with Larry Rue, and this is the Campbellian side of me. Obviously, this is when I started reading these texts and thinking about these things. It's been more than 20 years, Meili, since I first took a class with you. I think it was 2002, and so thank you. I still remember those classes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to me, particularly now that I'm retired, to hear comments like that.
It was wonderful. And you recommended John to me, so that is history now.